Hey, welcome to the Doc Analyzes Anything, the show where science and psychology meet, and we analyze any and every human behavior, including licking batteries to test, quote unquote, test if they're still good. And there's a follow up on this one. It says, because nothing says science like electrocuting your tongue for fun and curiosity.
I mean, there was much of my life that's how I tested if a 9 volt was still good.
I feel like that's a normal thing. However, I feel like there's always a bit of a shock, right?
It goes down significantly, and I have had them where they just didn't do it at all anymore towards the end. But I've also reached a point in my life where I don't feel the need to test it. If I'm thinking that battery might be dead, I'm gonna recycle it. I think it's good enough. It's time.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, yeah, that's a smart move. It doesn't feel good.
no, and for some reason I've become more of a wuss over time from that sort of thing. Like as a little kid, my grandma had a light switch that just like didn't have a plate cover on it, and I'd like routinely in the dark reach around to try to turn the light on and zap myself.
Nice.
I didn't learn. It didn't bother me that much that I got a little zap. It was like, ooh, kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I'm like, yeah, I would very carefully look at that light switch or any light switch, and same way that I can't just go jump in a cold lake anymore. I got to ease myself in just because it feels like I could have a heart attack at any moment, you know? So,
That's a real thing. Yeah. Yeah. We were on the coast of Oregon last summer and it was like I think it was like 50 degrees outside. So that tells you like how cold the water is. And my son was just diving in head first. Like an actual like harbor seal, like following him around, like, what are you doing, human?
yeah.
Trying this is my territory.
Yeah, I remember being a little kid swimming in Lake Superior, and my
Mm,
parents, and like it was like sweatshirt weather. My parents are
yeah.
like, I'm like, why aren't you guys getting in here? Like, come
Yeah.
on. Like, nope, you go ahead.
My parents invested in a pool. They keep that thing as an in-ground pool. They keep it. I've seen it at like 90 degrees before over the summer,
But
and
then you feel like you're sweating, but you can't sweat. It's actually
I know. Yeah,
worse.
yeah, yeah. But if our theory checks out, the as we age, we want to be cold less. So I think they're older than me, and therefore they like it warmer.
Yeah,
Correlation.
yeah, that'll be relevant here. But yeah, I'm I am wondering if it has like I think it may have to do with circulation. But I just remember like the elderly people in my family, like when they got older and that would happen, and the suggestion was like, oh well, they just lived with, took care of their parents who
Hmm.
got cold, and so then they had to get used to it. I'm like, I think there's something else going on there. But all right. Uh hello everyone. You'll notice things are a little different today. It's just Kyle and I jumping on because we wanted to make sure that we got this done in a timely manner. Today we'll be talking about why Tylenol doesn't cause autism and whether or not we actually know what does, or RFK is dumb as a box of rocks, or what causes autism. However you want to state it is fine. But uh,
This is unrelated, but where is that term? That was a box of rocks.
I do not know. And I
You
like I
didn't
wanted
prep
to
that in your
venture a
notes.
guess, and then I'm like, this is probably just gonna sound really dumb if I try to venture a guess right now and just make something up on the spot.
Fair enough.
Like, can I imagine like someone like, oh, their head's full of rocks just rattling around in there or something, and so a box of rocks, a head full of rocks. I don't know, but
Right on. Right on. Anyways, I digress.
I am your host, Dr. Steven Sparks. Along with me as my co-host, as always, Kyle Suri, and this one is annoying because in our field we have been dealing with these conversations and misleading information for so long. And it's annoying because we had something kind of fun, quirky, get everybody together and have a good time type conversation planned for this week. And now we have to drop everything and talk about this instead because people, and they shouldn't know who to trust. You should think, oh, the person in charge of this in the government should have some knowledge of the area. Um, but we know in this case that there is no reason to believe that this individual at least has any knowledge in this area at all. So let's talk about what is going on, what we do know, what we don't know, and try to do so in a way that doesn't offend anybody. As we're talking about things, there are going to be some loose ends that we just can't answer. And I think it's very important to mention across all of these is we are not blaming any person. There's a long history of parents and especially mothers being blamed. And let's be very clear that even if there is something going on and there's a lack of learning occurring, something like that, it is not due to the parenting style. It is, at least there's no evidence that it's due to any parenting style. Most kids, regardless of how good or bad their parents are, end up functioning fairly normally and it can be productive members of society. And many people who have an autism diagnosis can as well. Saw a lot of posts about the autism and Tylenol connection, or acetaminophen, really. I think
Good
we
job.
I think we I grew up in a household of people in the medical field, and so I was probably like 3 years old saying acetaminophen. Um,
Doing
I
better
think
than some folks.
I think the reason people struggled, or the reason they've called out Tylenol, is just because it's been hard to say. But there might be something else going on there too. It could be that there's donors for other political adversaries from certain companies, or we just had to figure out because we said in September we'd tell you what causes autism, so we had to figure something out to say.
Yeah,
Or
when you put when you put a deadline on it like that, and then you're coming up short in the end, it's like, uh, gotta grab something here.
yeah, when the numbers aren't looking good, and you need to come up with something to sensationalize away from, yourself and what's going on, that always could be a factor too. And truthfully, we just don't know why they decided to come up with this, except that there's a couple older studies that say, hey, there might be a relationship, but we'll uh we'll get to those in a minute. So first, we should probably discuss what autism spectrum disorder truly is, and how it's diagnosed. Where does it fit? Because I think society has this idea of what autism is. They see videos, they see pictures, but according to the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for psychological and behavioral conditions, in order to receive a autism spectrum disorder diagnosis as a child, and again, you can get this diagnosis as an adult, but the interference must start as a child, and so the criteria must go back to early childhood for it to actually fit. Um, First, they have to have persistent deficits in 3 areas of social behaviors. The first one is social emotional reciprocity. It's basically the emotional give and take between a person and someone else, that back and forth, and kind of understanding and sharing of the emotional ties or interactions with another person. Developing, understanding, and maintaining relationships. In some more profound cases, it's the lack of interest in that social interaction altogether, except when a need or want is being sought. For other people that don't necessarily fall in the cognitive disability range, but I still have the diagnosis, it can just be a lack of knowledge or understanding in which ways to interact with someone to kind of build some of those relationships. And then some issue with nonverbal communication, such as not being able to pick up on and respond to social cues, such as you may have something that gets too close and during the conversation. It may be that they say or do things that make a person uncomfortable. They don't notice the cue and know, okay, I shouldn't say these things, or not know how to deliver those nonverbal cues to someone else that's saying, hey, I'm uncomfortable in this conversation. I'd like it to end or change to something different.
So
So that
two of the three of those things.
correct. And then on the other side, there is certain behaviors, and we call them behavioral excesses in the psychological world. It doesn't mean it's excessive necessarily, but they're behavior that you wouldn't necessarily see in someone who does not have this diagnosis. So inflexibility to change in routine. You go through your daily routine, something big happens. It doesn't mean that it doesn't bother all of us, but there's an extent to which we all learn, okay, I just have to roll with the punches, deal with this. And sometimes in people with this diagnosis, they're unable to kind of roll with those punches and deal with that change in their routine without it becoming a bigger issue. restrictive or fixated interests that might be abnormal in focus or intensity. And so this is kind of where the idea of the savant comes in. Uh, for example, I had a child I worked with in uh, grad school years ago that could play Mozart on a little toy piano, and it was not that necessarily had this magical musical ear, but that was such a limited area of interest that they spent so much of their time playing that and listening to the music that they could reproduce it on something that really wasn't even meant to be able to handle that sort of music. It was extremely impressive, and you can see why people think this idea that, oh, people with autism just have these magical gifts that no one knows where they come from, but it really can be like, all right, I got into doing mathematic puzzles, and now I can do things with math that most people don't understand, not because I was born with this ability, but I've just spent so much of my time doing that.
It kind of perpetuates that too, that if you have autism, then everybody has some sort of savant gifting. That's not necessarily the case either.
Right. It seems to be, at least in my experience, usually not the case, but you will see that sometimes these areas of interest really tend to, be a fixation on something that could potentially, have that effect on the viewer from outside.
I had a kid who was very fixated on calendars to the point where you could give him a, like what day was I born? This is my birthday. Thursday. Got it. You're right.
And there's always something about being able to do something that others can't that everybody
Hmm.
thinks seems extra special. We
Right.
talked about
Right.
that briefly in that novel behavior invention um, episode where like the more something seems outside the box from what most people can do, the more genius it'll seem, even though it may not actually take that much genius to be able to do it. So the third one is hypo or hyperactivity in response to sensory input or fixation with sensory aspects of the environment. And so this has led to a lot of speculation in the past, most of it, fairly unfounded, that is a autism is a sensory disorder, not a neurological or behavioral disorder. And we can get into more examples of this later if we want to, or maybe we won't, who knows. But there are things that we all do that, are due to the sensory input. Um, and we talk about the number four here. We'll just kind of lump these together as the repetitive movements and sounds. So the stereotypy, the waving the hand in front of the face, that is kind of that stereotypical thought of autism, or some of the screaming and loud noises. um, that sensory input is reinforcing to most people, but then those around them, your parents, or maybe some of those nonverbal cues from the people in the environment, are like, hey, don't do that, sort of thing. And if you don't pick up on those cues, you may not your behavior may not be shaped the same way. um, or for instance, and I'm giving you all my kryptonite right now. I'm sure I think I've called it out, or Brad called me out before, but soft things like a super soft blanket or even cotton balls give me chills. I can't stand touching them, but I do because I need to. If I'm opening up a medicine bottle and there's a cotton ball in there, I might get chills, but I can do it without having any major issues, or help my kids cover up at night in their soft blanket. Like, I'm not a big fan of it, but I can make it happen. I can do it, and so a lot of these things tend to be considered like, oh, it's a hyperactivity to sensory input, or maybe we're both feeling the same thing, but my behavior has been shaped to not react in a way that is inappropriate, or that leads everybody to understand what I'm experiencing at that time versus others. And so it's impossible to know. Maybe there is, a hypersensitivity here, or it could be just, my behavior was shaped in a slightly different manner. And so we'll get into
Hmm.
some of these things as well. Um, One not on here, but that we see a lot of times too, is people talking about, oh, individuals, especially on, again, the more delayed side of the spectrum, don't experience pain the same way the rest of us do. But
Yeah, I hear that one a lot from parents, especially.
I mean, again, the social interaction piece and how reacting to pain is reinforced plays a big role as well. And I
Hmm.
usually use the example of being at my neighbor's house as a little kid. I run through the house, smash right into their like iron radiator, and it was painted white, but the layer of paint below it was red, and I didn't know that. So I look down, see red, and start freaking out. And people rush over, whatever, and they're like, "Oh, it's just paint. Flick it off, and then I'm okay." The question would be then: was the pain actually worse? Was it because it's been reinforced by care from others? Was it the panic that blood means bad? And if you don't have that social that level of social interaction, or that people rushing over and getting in your space could be aversive rather than reinforcing, or you don't have that rule to govern yourself, like, oh, blood means something dangerous has just happened, then I likely would not have reacted. And nowadays I don't react to things like that. My kids are always like, oh, what happened to your leg? And there's cuts all over the place, the bruises and stuff. I'm like, I have no idea. I did not even pay attention. uh we'll often be like walking to the store, and my wife will be like, "Why is your leg bleeding?" I'm like, "Don't know. I do not know."
This happen
So
often?
it does actually happen quite a bit. I must be much more clumsy than I think and not pay any attention to the pain whatsoever.
Yeah,
Um, but that's just to say that there isn't a true knowledge of whether these are experienced differently, or if, because of some of these social differences and their interaction differences, that it may just seem different to the observer. So.
yeah. It's a difficult dependent variable to measure too, because you're not experiencing what the other person is experiencing. Same as like sensory input or, self-stimulatory behavior too. It's hard to know exactly what might be going on. I'm sure we talked about automatic reinforcement before too, but things just being reinforcing because they are, to the individual. So it's just difficult to know and to measure.
A little bit of foreshadowing of things we might discuss a little bit too, but in general, things like, you know, what you are experiencing are learned through our verbal behavior. It's this being depressed. Organism, an animal, a person may act depressed, but they learn what depression is and how to define it and how to experience it by being told, oh, this person's depressed because they're going through this, or you must feel depressed because this happened to you. And so the same thing happens with pain and a lot of these other experiences as well. And if there is some difference in that, you know social interaction, then there would be some difference in how you react to those stimuli as well. So,
Sure. Yeah.
um, just to give more examples from this is from the Cleveland Clinic here, of things that you may or may like not see that would give you an idea. Okay, this could be someone who has a um, autism diagnosis, or might be uh, may receive one if they were tested. Kind of going into what we just went over, but some more examples from the Cleveland Clinic is really what we're doing here. If a toddler doesn't follow your gaze or look at things you're pointing to, doesn't respond to their name, seems uninterested in taking turns, like playing peekaboo, doesn't seek you out to share something they've discovered, looks away rather than making eye contact, uses your hand as a tool to pick things up they want, or prefers to play by themselves beyond the age of 2 rather than liking interaction with either adults or children. Um, Talks about, like, if they're a little bit older, or only has interest in a narrow range of topics, has a lot of one-sided conversations without the back and forth talk, seems uninterested in starting conversation, has difficulty expressing their feelings, understanding how others feel, has difficulty using and understanding body language, speaks in a monotone or sing-song voice, has difficult noticing social cues, and then for adolescents, has trouble understanding what others mean and may not recognize sarcasm, doesn't initiate social interactions, makes little or no eye contact, has difficulty mixing spoken word and body language, has a hard time building relationships with peers, gets along more easily with younger kids or grown-ups, has difficulty seeing something from someone else's point of view, doesn't understand certain social rules like greetings or personal space, or appears standoffish around others. And so these are just the examples that Cleveland Clinic has given to describe um, what are we calling the criteria
Uh,
that we just went over?
yeah, behavioral criteria.
Yeah, the DSM-5 criteria that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, when we read that, it's very much in jargon, and so this kind of gives you an idea of what it actually could look like um, from a outside observer perspective.
And that's it's good to know that because it kind of cues you into to like how diagnosing is actually done, obviously, but like the like there's no blood test, like there's no definitive test, and like there's um you know, parents who have taken their kids in, it often takes a very long time to get in to see somebody to do this diagnosis.
And also, I mean, everybody reacts differently depending on the situation they're in. There's a level of reactivity when there's someone there observing you.
Hmm.
And if you have a child who's spent time in like the school system, they may have found some adaptive behaviors that kind of hide some of the things that could be interesting or might lead to a diagnosis from that
Hmm.
professional. And so it it's the idea of hiding the autism, I don't think would be fair. It really is, like you're saying, kind of just adapting to the moment that could mask some of those things. Um, I also wanted to mention that according to the Cleveland Clinic and most experts, but I read it directly from their website, so why I'm quoting them. Autism isn't a disease, and this is an important distinction because a lot of people out there trying to sell cures to the disease,
Hmm.
and they are wild, and we won't get into too many of them here. It'll probably be its own episode sometime, but there's therapies that trying to get toxic metals out of your child's body. There's things like uh, one was giving children parasites, and somehow these parasites, these worms, were going to cure them of autism. And one thing that I think hopefully everybody notices as we're reading these lists here, these are, behaviors or things that would be learned through social interaction. These aren't things that just happen magically in our bodies. It's not like language just all of a sudden appears one day. It is something that we learn through interaction with those around us. And so even if there is some underlying physical cause, and then you find a cure for that underlying physical cause, these things are still missing from the repertoire and need to go back and be learned. And that is why um, ABA or applied behavior analysis is one of, if not the main recommended treatment for autism, is because what we're doing or what they're doing. I haven't actually worked in that area in over a decade now, but go back and reteach these skills that were missed or lost through the process earlier on. And so it is discussed as a neurological or neurodivergent type of uh, disorder. But even then, it's kind of a chicken or the egg type discussion because these are behaviors that just haven't been learned along the way. And as we start talking about scientifically what we do know, that is kind of where the main barrier is. And so is it that there's differences in the brain because certain what we will discuss as like cusps or milestones or different main behaviors that you need to learn to then learn other behavior are missed, kind of like the same argument that they don't know if the depression changes the brain chemistry or the brain chemistry causes the depression. We don't know, is it that because we have a different learning history that it changes the brain, or does the brain cause that different learning history? um, but what we do know is that the main disconnect is that somehow some way the behavior that would normally be reinforced through social interaction starting at birth immediately and through early childhood for some reason is not as reinforcing to people who are on receive an autism spectrum diagnosis later on. And so all these behaviors we're talking about are social mediated. everything is taught through that reinforcement from primary caregivers, friends, family, those around them. And if you are, trying to work with your child to learn, whatever language you speak, starting off early with like real simple utterances. If you're labeling an animal as a small child, they'll be like, oh, yep, that is a dog, or that's not quite right, but this is a dog and this is a dog. But if for some reason that praise or that interaction isn't reinforcing, then most
Or
likely that
punishing
child is
even.
not going to learn that skill.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I worked in a clinic where, we were teaching verbal operants to a small kid, and every time this kid would get it correct, the therapist would yell really loud and clap her hands, and he would just hold like, it was annoying to me, and I don't experience you know, sound isn't that aversive to me, I can't imagine. I was like, "You're punishing this kid for getting these answers correct."
Yeah, and I should mention too, it's not just about reinforcement. I mean, some of those interactions when something is wrong or inappropriate would be punished as well. And so if you're not picking up on those social cues,
Yeah,
it's not punishing, then some of that, behavior that society would say, and we should be careful saying inappropriate. When we're talking about inappropriate, we mean something that's actually harmful or dangerous most of the time. But it may just not fit what the parent's social norm is for that situation as well.
right,
And
right.
if they're not picking up on the punishment or the reinforcement isn't appropriate, then that behavior is not getting shaped. And so,
Mhm.
um, what shaping truly is, just for everybody out there too, because we probably have used this word a lot and not necessarily explained it well enough, is you start off with some behavior that is in some way, shape, or form related to what the end behavior is. And so think of a little kid that just goes, ah, oh, that almost sounded like dog. And so as time goes on, you're going to reinforce more like closer and closer approximations to the sound of dog, and then extinguish or stop reinforcing sounds that were less like that, because now you've reached this next step towards the actual utterance you're looking for. And so this all starts with almost all children very early. Any babbling, whatever, they babble, all of a sudden, hey, that sounded like this, and now I'm going to start shaping it. And that's really where our earliest and um, the earliest forms of language that then become our verbal repertoire, where it starts. Um, from there, again, if it's not reinforcing, even if you are able to go back and teach some level of language, uh, this is how we learn emotions too. You have a stronger verbal repertoire now. Like I said, someone says something, or they know that someone's just yelled at you, like, "Oh, you must feel sad," or "You must feel angry." Those words don't mean anything, even though your behavior may show that that is how you're feeling. The words don't mean anything until you learn them, and so you can't necessarily learn to label and self-regulate those emotions if you're experiencing them without understanding what they are, or how they work, or why they've occurred.
Yeah. So it's always so frustrating to me seeing like teaching scenarios. I see this in schools a lot, where they will, when a kid is visually angry or frustrated, they use that as an opportunity to teach uh like a card or something like, "You're angry, look, you're angry." Like, yes, I am angry. Like, he's not going to learn what that word means in this moment, like there's already a lot of deficits in language already. So we're teaching trying to teach a very complex operant at that point.
And it's a good point too, because we think about it. Go right now and tell me, like, all right, what's a operational definition of angry? And like, it would take time to try to come up with a good one, or you'd have to pull out a dictionary. Like, people know what anger is; they know when they feel angry,
Mhm.
but how do you define that? Um, but if you've been thrown in all these different situations throughout your life from birth to 3 years old, and now you have this concept formation of what angry is, even though no one's ever actually given you this definition, it's created this idea. And that's why our emotions feel so real to us, and we tie these labels to them so closely, is because our entire life we're just surrounded with these explanations of what we're doing. And we'll get into each emotion in its own episode later and talk about how these things are shaped and where they come from, and why it's actually, even though the labels and kind of how we talk about them are made up through our language, it's extremely useful for being able to function in a group setting in a culture or society. Um, but if you're not picking up on these cues, you hear people labeling things. You may be able to use that language, like that label, but it doesn't mean you've developed this concept formation necessarily of what depression is, what anger is, what sadness is. You just know I feel bad at this moment. You need language to be told a rule, but so much of what we learn in those first few years, you can't give a 1 year old or a 2 year old, here's the definition of something, or here's the rule. If you do this, this will happen, without having fairly complex language for them to be able to repeat it themselves, remember, and use that to their advantage later on. And so it is through these direct interactions and this direct teaching, these direct, what we call direct acting contingencies, that most of this is learned. And so we'll get into why the Tylenol, it's not that we can prove without any doubt whatsoever that there's not any time ever in the human, like, history of humanity that caused something that could be diagnosed as autism, but that there's no reason to believe it has because there's no evidence for it, is kind of the discussion here. So really, when we're getting into this and why we started, or I started this, I think Kyle's just along for the ride for the most part on this one, but this part of this conversation this way is because if we want to find the cause for autism, we need to figure out why, for some people, those early childhood interactions aren't reinforcing or punishing in the way that they are for the rest of us. And so
Mm.
discussing it in terms of, hey, there's this physical ailment that's being caused by this thing, doesn't really fit the bill unless we can find and prove that there is a physical ailment that then makes these reinforcers and punishers ineffective, basically, is where to start from. And again, I know I said at the very beginning, but this is not because caregivers just aren't trying to reinforce or punish and react normally to these behaviors. It is because for some reason their interaction is not affecting the child the same way. So um, usually we're talking about neurological, genetic, or epigenetic things being involved. We'll get into those as well as some of the real out there ideas. I'll call out, there was that horrible incident in Metro Detroit not too long ago where someone was using hyperbaric chambers to try to cure a child of their autism, even though there's no idea or no reason to believe that oxygen deprivation is one of the causes, or even if it was, that putting someone in a chamber like that would cure them of it or teach them kind of, it would almost have to be a magical teaching of this repertoire that just wasn't learned naturally. And so we know that behavior analysts do know how to teach this repertoire. Some are going to be much better than others. You can't just assume that you're going to always find the best person and they're going to be great at it every time. But that is why that is the main intervention that's kind of accepted out there. And why we may sound like we're saying, nope, just come to us, even though that's not what we personally do anymore. So hopefully it doesn't sound like that. But
Yeah.
you can see when you don't know where to turn or what to do, why people will think, oh, everybody's just trying to pull me in and get my money, sort of thing.
There's a lot of money to be made by acting like you can quote unquote fix somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We should have
unfortunately.
started this episode with the song Lily the Pink. Are you familiar?
I'm not. What is that?
So the Irish Rovers, Irish drinking folk music group. Again, my parents put it on, and so now our little boys love Irish drinking music. But they did a song. It's about a true person who was selling their version of snake oil. It was Lily the Pink. She had these tonics that she was giving people, made all this money, and probably had some detrimental effects on people, but certainly didn't help anybody. And so we should have seen if we got permission to play that for everybody. But you can go look it up. Irish Rovers, great time. So
I think you can hum like 8 seconds of a song before you like start to right or something like that. So if you want to take the floor
you
here.
mean people can? I cannot.
Fair.
um. So let's start with Tylenol, just because that's what's been getting everybody hot and bothered lately. Acetaminophen. Um, there was one or two studies. They've been out for a while. They've been reviewed. Not any follow up for anybody to believe it. Yep, this is a cause. But it suggested there was a slightly higher, like, and quite slightly. It was not a big effect size whatsoever. That moms who consumed acetaminophen while pregnant were slightly higher to have a child who is diagnosed with autism later on. Um, Before we even get to why that's potentially detrimental, we'll talk about, okay, what do we mean when we're talking about these studies and correlation in general. So if you say you have the cause of something, it needs to cause it. So if Tylenol or acetaminophen as a whole caused autism, we would need to see that every parent or every mom who was pregnant who then had a child with autism later on had to have consumed that at least at some level, and you'd think probably substantially throughout time. Um, you'd also have to look into and try to study. All right, why is it that other people that use acetaminophen, their children were not diagnosed with autism? What's the difference there? So it's kind of an all or nothing thing when you're talking about a true cause. Really, I'm sure the people who did this study never said we found the cause at all. I can almost guarantee they said, "Hey, there might be a slight correlation here. We should look into this further someday."
I did read into, like, one of the authors was talking. I think basically he had said, and this is obviously after the announcement came to light, but he had said there were a lot of questions worth exploring, but not anything. And I might be misquoting him, but something to the effect of, like a good scientist would say, "Hey, this is worth looking at, but take these limitations with with that."
Yeah, and it's you know again partially people in government not knowing the difference between correlation and causation. Partially, the media latches on and wants to talk about. It's kind of the sensationalism we've talked about before. I know I've used
Hmm.
this example before, but I always go back to that one time I was watching the news and they said, "Hey, we found the gene that causes stuttering." And it was like, 40% of people that stutter have this gene malformality. It's like, that's only 40%. What about the rest? They're that would be a fairly decent correlation to study further. Turns out it was one family they were studying, and that they never said that. All they said is there may be a correlation there. Um,
Hey, news happens fast, man.
I know, and they never came back and said, walked that one back at all.
Yeah.
Um, but and I'm sure I used this example before too. It's also correlational data that shows that ice cream sales and the murder rate both increase at the same time. And
Hmm.
so if we went off the same scientific method here of correlation does equal causation, hey, ice cream sales cause murder, we should ban all ice cream. But the fact is that summer months, it's warmer, more people are out congregating and interacting with one another. It's going to have more violence because there's more chances of those having a negative interaction, the same way that people tend to buy more ice cream in the hot months. And so they're maybe related temporally or in time with one another, but that is the only way they are related with one another. The same way that Tylenol may have an increased, usage rate around the same time that people started thinking about autism and talking about autism more, but that doesn't mean there's any connection with one another. And that's not to mention the potential damage of a mom who has a fever and is told Tylenol is the safest, medication to use to bring that fever down. Now I don't use Tylenol, and that fever could have much more detrimental effects on the unborn fetus than, autism. So,
And the number of reasons that a woman may need to take Tylenol as well. What is she going through physically at the time, and have those conditions been studied in terms of their relationship to autism diagnoses?
right. Yeah. And there's, again, just correlation at this point for any of these
Right.
causes.
Yep.
We'll let's just jump out there and say that we're not going to give you a cause here, you know, and we're going to say that
Well, I
the
thought that's
lack.
where this was
Yeah,
going.
I'm going to step out here. I'm going to RFK it for everybody and tell you what. No, um, we are stepping out on that ledge is saying that for some reason it not being reinforcing is the cause, but what causes it to not be reinforcing is just one step down the line and doesn't really give you a true answer here. But uh, there is some idea that infections during pregnancy has some correlation to increased autism rates and other issues as well. Stress on the baby in general could be a factor.
Hmm.
Um, we talked about in the genetics study, and we'll talk about genetics real quick again, just as a refresher. But if you're in an environment that you come into contact with something, it can have an epigenetic effect where it activates a gene, and then maybe that is why you know this difference occurs. We don't know that. There's just potential correlation there, and so the illness could have an epigenetic effect. It could be genetic in that way, even though we've discussed before how genetics themselves still have some holes in the idea of that being a major cause of autism. And I guess we might as well jump ahead real quick, just because I said it and I don't need to have people yelling at the computer or their headphones right now. But there is a very strong correlation with identical twins. I can't remember what now. I don't have our genetics note pulled up right now, but it's something like in the 90 something percent that genetically identical twins at the moment of conception, so identical twins, will both have a diagnosis of autism. Um, then non-identical, who share on average 50% of their genetic makeup because they're getting it half and half from their parents, um, in the womb at the same time. I believe it was like in the 50% range, something
Hmm.
maybe 60% range, will both have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum disorder, and then siblings who were born at different times. Well, I think it's in like the 20s or teens, likelihood of both being diagnosed. Are you looking it up for me right now?
Yeah, yeah, I gotcha. So identical twin, if one has autism, the rate of the other identical twin having autism ranges from 60 to 90%. And then fraternal twins ranges from 3 to 31%.
So that's a non-identical. Um, and when the ones I was pulling off of, I guess I should have pulled up those notes there. Um, they gave not a range, but just the average, and I think that
Hmm.
again was from either CDC or Cleveland Clinic or one of these that should be a fairly trusted uh, source. But the biggest point there is, okay, you have fraternal or non-identical twins have a higher incident rates than other siblings, but not as high as the identical twins. That must mean that there is a genetic component, a genetic cause of autism. It may not be the cause, but there's at least a component there. There's a strong correlation. But the interesting part with that is if you are looking at the genetic makeup of the non-identical twins and the siblings who are born at different times, the chances of them having the same genetic makeup is identical, because it's still two sperm, two eggs, just at the same time instead of different times, versus the identical twin, which is same egg, then it splits. So to me, that suggests, and I don't think I should just speak from my own perspective. I don't know that I'm an expert on genetics, but it would suggest there has to be other factors, such as the timing of birth, what the children go through in utero, maybe what's going on in the world around them. Because if the genetics are going to be the same whether they're born at the same time or not, why is it that sharing a womb increases the chances of both children having autism? It could be that mom and dad lived in a house with lead paint at that point. You know what I mean? It could be that they grew up. One was born before the pandemic, one was after, and now You're talking about completely different social interactions. It's impossible to know, but that would suggest Gen X itself cannot be the main contributing factor. It can just be a strong potential contributing factor. And it, I think, if anything, adds to the idea of the epigenetics of those environmental conditions, playing a major role in what genes are turned on or off or activated or deactivated, since it would happen at the same time with the non-identical twins versus other siblings. And so things like heavy metals and PFAS, directly, there's no, true evidence that suggests that those cause autism, but we know they're a lot more frequently, available in the environment now than they were 100 years ago. And what if that was the sort of thing that maybe caused an epigenetic change? That's possible. We're talking layer upon layer, and we're still just getting at the fact that it makes these interactions less reinforcing or less punishing, and not that it's just like poof, we've created this disease sort of thing.
Right. And even then, yeah, I'm not aware, at least, of any definitive research on PFAS, heavy metals, anything like that. So again, we're still it would be correlative. That one of the big things is just the increased attention to early diagnosis. I mean, not to be political, but some people are citing increased diagnosis rates, through the year. Now it's this, now it's this, now it's even more. That does not even that I mean that's correlative. Like that does not even mean for sure that the number of people in existence uh are more likely to be autistic now just because the diagnosis rate has increased.
Yeah, let's talk about that towards the end, because I had that on my notes, but we'll get to that in a minute, because I don't want to do that and then jump back into other potential, or I don't even want to say potential causes, but things that people are saying out there that causes autism. But we will get into real quickly at the end why there might be an increased, trend in cases of autism, and how that may or may not be what it looks like.
That's fair, but as long as I get credit for bringing it up and not you.
You can put your name on, put your stamp right on there. Like, this is going to be the only clip that he puts out from this episode. It's just himself saying that over and over and over again. Um, so getting back to the heavy metals, the PFAS, um, like the idea that vaccines cause autism, that's come about partially because the amount of vaccines children got increased with this incident rate we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because people looked up the ingredient list and saw, oh, wait a minute, this is in there. That can't be good for us. And I will mention, again, not being a biologist, but learning what I have about vaccines and how they work, sometimes those materials just help it enter the bloodstream. The particle size of things that can get in and through the blood-brain barrier versus that can't, and using other materials to then make it so they can get through some of those membranes, some of those barriers, can have a huge impact on their viability and their effectiveness. And so
But they're
let's
such big
remember,
words, though.
well, let's just remember also that, like, you start throwing out, the chemical makeup of anything we eat or consume, or ourselves even, you're gonna have people start freaking out. So that's part of the scare tactic there. But vaccines was basically just one guy, Andrew Wakefield, coming up with this
Mm-hmm.
theory and trying to get rich and famous by pushing this thing, even though there was no evidence for it other than the correlation that, hey, kids started getting more vaccines right as we started talking about autism more. And this guy at this point, I mean, he's lost his medical license. He's listed online as just being a fraud.
Is he still
All
around?
so
Yeah, he's
he's a
still alive.
laughing stock. Because he became a laughing stock, they went and he retracted everything, and then years later came back and said, nope, I don't retract it. trying to like regain some level of career because he had
Yeah,
just been
yeah.
destroyed by coming out with this without any real evidence for it.
He's kind
Um,
of like it's kind of like doubled down on it, but he has a bigger audience now,
well, that's probably just because of the means of finding an
for
audience.
sure. Yeah.
Um,
No, that doesn't
but
mean he's correct. Yeah,
no, there's it is exhaustive. There are the number of studies that have been done that show that they're like the correlation isn't even really there, except for again that period of time that people started talking about autism more. And I won't go into like too many of the studies, but the one that always stuck out the most to me was during this period of time that they collected data, the incident rate of autism in Japan was exactly the same as it was in the United States. But during that time period, they weren't using any vaccinations whatsoever.
mm,
And so I can't remember, I think it was the 80s or the 90s or something like that. But whatever it was, the kids just weren't getting vaccinated, yet the incident rate was the same. So if this is the cause,
yeah,
how can that be the cause? It just
right.
it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
There's a lot of other kind of crazy explanations too. Again, no evidence for them. Um, One that's come up quite a bit recently is a disease called pandas. I don't remember what panda stands for, but most, the medical community doesn't even recognize it as a true disease. You have to find one or two doctors that actually believe its existence, get tested, and then I think it's one of those that, like, everybody that gets tested kind of, yep, nope, you have it sort of things. It's
what
not
is
covered.
pandas? I don't know what it is.
Yeah, look at it. It is.
I'm like fact checking mode. I'm the
Yeah,
man in
no,
the suit today.
I wish you would do that every episode because I
Fine, I
caught
will.
myself I caught myself on one the other day, but it's too late now. It's out there. But yeah, it's people are just coming up with these explanations without any, findings. You have a parent who's, you know, lost trying to figure out what it is to do. What can I do to help my child? You hear, okay, here's this disease that's causing it. Here's some medication and a diet that they have to follow. It's really expensive, but then your child be cured, and you always want to think, okay, I can cure my child. That's wonderful. But again, nobody is talking about having to go back and then everything that hasn't been learned over that period of time still needing to be learned in order for the child not to have this diagnosis. And again, I want to discuss this in terms of, the kids on this area of the spectrum that would have a learning disability as well. I don't want it to sound like we're needing to or should cure anybody just because they're part of the autistic community. But, you know, if you have someone who believes their child was poisoned by heavy metals, here's chelation therapy. You're going to take them out of, the autism center and do this, basically blood transfusion to get the heavy metals out. They're going to feel ill for days at a time. You have to do this several times to clear them of these heavy metals. And now they come back in and they still haven't gained, the skills that we're talking about, but they've lost that time they could have been working on those things and gone through a fairly traumatic experience through the process. And so those are the sort of things that why we don't like the idea of talking about autism in terms of being, first of all, a disease rather than just a set of behaviors or a neurological disorder. The gut microbiome, the idea that the foods or the issues in the stomach are causing autism is a big one. Food sensitivities. I was looking them up. Uh, Hot tubs. I did not know that some people thought hot tubs caused autism.
Like while in utero or like
I did not look deeper into it. I just saw hot tubs and wrote it down. I don't even know if you have to use one. I think you could just like, be in the vicinity, like, oh, that hot tub, it caused it. You know what I mean? Also, plastic toys and demon possession were some of the others that I saw as well. So
I unfortunately have had a lot of talks with caregivers about demon possession, more than I ever thought I would getting into this field.
yeah, I mean, you get rid of that demon doesn't mean you're going to be feeling any less awkward in a group of people. You know what I mean?
Right.
And
Right.
again, it's all comes down to not whether or not someone has some like quirky behavior, but does it affect their life in a negative way in any way, shape, or form that people might be able to help with. We
Hmm.
aren't trying to change people for the sake of changing people, but help them hopefully make their lives better if possible. So, getting back to the things that Kyle wants to talk about, uh, what are some of the things, the reasons that we might see these increases that we've seen lately? Because obviously that's the thing that the media is latching on to, is like, look at these numbers, it's a epidemic, what are we going to do about this? um Changes in diagnosis, like if we look at, originally it was really just the people on the profound end that usually receive that diagnosis. One of the big differences is, in order to get any assistance, whether it be grants or money or even just a therapist to talk to, you have to have some level of some type of diagnosis that fits that billing code. And so, uh, got an email the other day from one of our contract partners that said, "Hey, these services, we've got some issues with the diagnoses not meeting the billing code necessities. Like, these people, because of the diagnosis they've been given, do not, we can't bill Medicare or Medicaid for the services. So we need you all to go in and double check the diagnosis and maybe change the diagnosis so they can get these services." They didn't come around and say it, but that was the gist of it. Like, hey, this person has this, it could be this, right? Wink, wink, nod, nod. It doesn't actually matter for the services they're going to get. But in order for them to get paid for by the system, it
Man,
needed to fit this. And so you imagine, a lot of kids struggling in school, they may just barely fit the diagnosis on one end of the spectrum, but in order to get any assistance whatsoever, they need that diagnosis to then, get some of that help. And so I'm not going to argue there's any overdiagnosis, because you don't want to assume anybody is faking anything just to get someone help, but it's not out of the question that, like, all right, right on the fence. Or maybe I had one client who had an autism diagnosis that had none of the symptoms that I had ever seen, but had some severe behavior issues as a child. And I'm like, you know what? If that allows us to help you, I'm like, I see no problem or no reason to try to correct anybody here. You know what I mean?
sure. Like he
I
had
mean,
received the diagnosis just because they were like unsure
they
or
didn't know what to
on
do.
the fence. Yeah.
Yeah, they gave him like 20 different diagnoses, because I walk in the door, nice as can be, comes up, shakes my hand, eye contact, has a conversation with me. Everything
Yeah.
seems better than a lot of children at that age would have interacted with an adult. Come play with me. I want to show you this. I want to do this with you. But also at one point, set the house on fire because they were angry. And so, all right, well, if this allows me to help you not set the house on fire, then so be it. It means that we don't know what the cause is, other than the behaviors aren't being shaped, because seemingly, at least, reinforcement and punishment that shapes most of our behavior just isn't working the same way. It's not effective, or it's not as effective. And so, depending on which end of the spectrum we're talking, they may learn some of the things but not others, may not pick up on some of the cues like others might, or may just not learn to speak at all. It's just figuring out why that reinforcement doesn't occur or isn't effective seems to be where we really should be at now, rather than saying, hey, there's a correlation between one thing and autism, let's attack that thing without more evidence. And
And there's a lot of people attacking a lot of those different questions too. It's not like we're just stumped. It's just kind of like we here's what we know, but like good scientists, everybody in that community is saying here's what we know, here's what we don't know.
yeah,
And that's a really important attitude that's lacking when we come out and just give broad statements based on a few studies.
yeah, I think this is just a big deal because the government has come out and called it out, but it is very much everybody has their own idea, everybody's throwing out blame here and there. And I would say, just to the public as a whole, if you see someone say they found the cause of anything, you should probably be questioning it. If you
Mm-hmm.
find someone come out and say, hey, the scientific study shows there's a good chance there's a correlation here, there might be some relation, we need to study it further and try to figure this out, then that makes sense. If someone comes out tomorrow and says they found the cause, you should be skeptical, but know that maybe there's, a correlation. Let's put our time and effort into helping people who have this diagnosis. Continue the studies, keep trying to figure it out, but in the meantime, let's stop blaming one another and actually just trying to go out there and help people the way we know we can, I think is the big thing. It's just
I think it's a good conclusion to make.
it's just one more example of finding reasons to be, argue with one another more than anything, it seems like.
Right. Right. Well, and don't listen to medical advice by someone who isn't qualified to give it.
You
I don't
mean
know,
someone
try not to
that,
be controversial here, but
yeah, someone that, knowing that someone says that the reason they made it through school was their heroin use, maybe not the one who should be suggesting treatments for anyone struggling in school or in any other form whatsoever. So
yeah, I I don't know that should be a controversial thing to say, but here we are.
let's try to stay positive and know that, at least a lot of children who have some disabilities can be helped with what science does know so far, and just try to stay positive in this crazy world where everything's painted in a negative light, because you just never know when that ice cream man come around the next corner and get you. So